Hey, Shalom, Israel, Yahweh by Shem Yahweh Shai Barakatham, Yahweh Shemalatham by Shem Yahweh Shai. We got the ISUPK started out of 1 West, 125th Street, Harlem, New York, under Commander General Yohana. And since 1969, we've been pushing this truth. The so called blacks, Hispanics, and Native Indians are the 12 tribes of Israel. This is ISUPK Kentucky. And this is What You Didn't Learn in History Class, Episode 6. What we finna get into tonight is we're going to go into the history of pan-Africanism. We're going to go to all the people that contributed to pan-Africanism. And then I've got something on Angela Davis. Was she an Edomite? And when I say Edomite, I'm talking about the biblical name for what we call the white race today. All right, so let's go ahead and get into it. Now, the first thing I've got, we're gonna get into it with some images. Like I said, we're gonna go over the history of pan-Africanism. And we're gonna go into all the key players of pan-Africanism. All right. So on the screen here, we have Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. Richard Allen on the left and Absalom Jones on the right. Now, if you Google these two individuals, it'll say that they are America's two of America's founding fathers. Right? Two of America's founding fathers. Now, how can you be an American founding father if you're not a colonizer? I say it again. How can you be one of America's founding fathers and not be a colonizer? Now, if I may Google these two, right? Richard Allen, one of America's founding fathers, and Absalom Jones was one of America's founding fathers. Now, they're both Freemasons. And they're both founders of the AME Church. Now, the AME Church, we're talking about the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, we're talking about the origins of the so-called black community following the Christian church in North America comes from the AME Church. And it's also the introduction of this so-called African identity, right? So this is Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. All right. So Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, and I think we may have some technical difficulty. All right, so Richard Allen, Absalom Jones, two of America's black founding fathers. And I'll pose the question again. How can you be one of America's founding fathers and not be a colonizer? Right? How can you be one of America's founding fathers and not be a colonizer? And again, these two men were founders of the AME Church. Founders of the AME Church, and they were both Freemasons. All right, so the next image I got for y'all. All right, this is Melville Herskowitz. All right, this is Melville Herskowitz, and he's known as the white founding father of African studies. Right? Go ahead and look him up. This is Melville Herskowitz, the white Jewish father of Africana studies or African studies. This is where we further get the myth of this African identity from. Now, what Melville Herskowitz did, he wrote a book. He wrote a book called The Myth of the Negro Past. And in this book, he tried to prove that so-called Black Americans don't have any culture to speak of in the Americas, and all of the cultural traits of Black Americans come from an African past. So this is where this African identity starts to come from. Again, this is Melville Herskowitz in his book, Myth of the Negro Past. All right, so about the author, it says Melville Herskowitz, 1895 to 1963, was an anthropologist most well known for his study of the myth of the Negro past. He studied at the University of Chicago and Columbia University and later taught at Northwest University. His additional works include Economic Transitions in Africa, The Human Factor of Changing Africa, and The Life in the Haitian Valley. All right. It says, almost 50 years ago, Melville Herskowitz set out to debunk the myth that Black Americans have no cultural past. Originally published in 1941, his unprecedented study on Black history and culture recovered a rich African heritage in religious and secular life. Now, again, this book, The Myth of the Negro Past, was to push this idea of Black Americans being African. Now, something else about this book is that this book was always in the fiction section. So we have the father of African studies, a white Jewish man named Melville Herskowitz, writes a book called Myth of the Negro Past, and it is in the fiction section. So for everybody that is into this so-called pan-Africanism, right, this red, black, and green, this is your daddy right here. If you follow pan-Africanism, if you follow this RBG nonsense, this is your father right here, Melville Herskowitz. All right, if you follow this RBG red, black, and green nonsense, that's your father right here. All right. So the next image, this is Robert Finley. Right now, Robert Finley founded the American Colonization Society. Now, the American Colonization Society was to send so-called Black Americans to Liberia. Now, we all thought that Marcus Garvey was the founder of the Back to Africa movement. We all been told that it was Marcus Garvey who wanted to send so-called Black Americans to Liberia. But no, it's right here. Robert Finley. Look up American Colonization Society. And the whole idea was to send so-called Black Americans to Liberia. So the whole Back to Africa movement was started by a white boy, Salakia. Was started by an oppressor, a so-called white man, the biblical nation of Edom or Esau. Right? Robert Finley is the founder of the Back to Africa movement. All right. So if you follow that Back to Africa nonsense, all right, it was founded by an oppressor named Robert Finley. All right, let's get into Marcus Garvey a little bit. Marcus Garvey. All right. Now we've all seen this image on the left. Right? Marcus Garvey with the whole get up on here. But this is actually the uniform of the Right Eminent Grand Commander. Right? Now, what does that mean? That means that Marcus Garvey was a York Rite Freemason. All right? Marcus Garvey was a York Rite Freemason because he wears the uniform of the Right Eminent Grand Commander. All right, so this is evidence here that Marcus Garvey was a Freemason, just like two of America's Black founding fathers were also Freemasons. All right. Now we've got Marcus Garvey. And to the right of the photo, we got this devil right here. This devil's name is Walter Plecker. All right. Now, Walter Plecker was one of the individuals responsible for the paper genocide of Native Indians. Right. Walter Plecker was one of the people responsible for the paper genocide of Native Indians. So why would Marcus Garvey be in a picture with an oppressor and a man that pushes for paper genocide of Native Americans? Let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from this article. This article was written in 2001, and it's titled Strange Bedfellows, Eugenicists, White Supremacists, and Marcus Garvey in Virginia, 1922 to 1927. Again, eugenicists, white supremacists, and Marcus Garvey in Virginia, 1922 to 1927. Garvey. And again, what is Marcus Garvey's relationship with the man responsible for paper genocide of the North American Indian? All right, let's get into it. Now, this article, this is Marcus Garvey's response all right. It says, I am surprised at the editorial and Negro world of today's date under caption of Marcus Garvey and American Society, in which I am mentioned as making statements regard to messengers Cox and Powell of Richmond, Virginia, in their respective societies. I know nothing of the spirit of the editorial, which I regard as mischievous. I repudiate the attack upon these two friends. Now, this is Marcus Garvey referring to two white supremacists and eugenicists, Powell and Cox. All right. Now, Marcus Garvey calls two white supremacists his friends, right? Which have given no cause to be thus insulted. I further object to my name being used in editorial of that nature, attacking the organization of persons without my knowledge and approval. You will please reproduce this in its entirety. The policy of the organization has been defined by me more than 1,000 times, and has been absolutely no change on my part. And it's talking about Garvey's cooperation and public support of John Powell and E.S. Cox. Now let's get into John Powell. All right, here's another before we get into Powell, here's more on the article. All right. It says Plecker and Cox shared this statement. According to Plecker, there's only one absolute solution to the problem, advanced by Lincoln and more recently by Major Ernest X. Cox in his splendid work, White America. This solution is the gradual deportation of the Negro. All right. Garvey decried the attempt made by the NAACP to fight for social equality and claimed the social equality campaign would lead ultimately to further disturbances and riots, lynching, and mob rule. So we're talking about Marcus Garvey being close friends with white supremacists, eugenicists, and people that pushed the earlier white movement to send so-called black people to Africa. All right, so here's Ernest Cox, one of Marcus Garvey's good friends here. Said lobby for the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 and a proponent of the Back to Africa movement. And again, the Back to Africa movement was started by our oppressor. Again, the Back to Africa movement was started by our oppressor. So here's Ernest Cox, one of Marcus Garvey's good friends. Now here's the other one. This is the devil that was in the picture right here. All right, Walter Plecker. It says he worked at Virginia's Vital Records and changed Native Indian birth certificates. All right, this devil right here worked in vital statistics and is responsible for changing Native Indian birth certificates. Right, this is called paper genocide. All right, if I may, Google the article "Paper Genocide of Native Americans from 1790 Census to the Present," and it goes into detail about this devil, one of Marcus Garvey's good friends, how this devil was changing Native Indian birth certificates. So this devil right here was changing Native Indian birth certificates to Black, Negro, and colored. And at the same time, Marcus Garvey was pushing to send these very same people to Africa. All right, y'all see the connection now? Marcus Garvey was good friends with Walter Plecker. Walter Plecker was changing Native Indian birth certificates to Negro and Black. And Marcus Garvey was pushing to send these same people to Africa. Again, this is what you didn't learn in history class, episode 6. All right. So let's get into it a little further. And we'll bring this into the mid 1900s, right? The mid 20th century. All right. Now on the screen here, this is a man named Frank Marshall Davis. All right. Frank Marshall Davis was a card-carrying communist. It was a mentor to y'all's favorite president, Barack Obama. Right? He was a famous mentor to everybody's favorite president, Barack Obama. All right, here's the source. The Communist, Frank Marshall Davis, The Untold Story of Barack Obama's Mentor. If I may, check out this book. All right, The Communist, Frank Marshall Davis, The Untold Story of Barack Obama's Mentor. Now, something else about Frank Marshall Davis. Right, Frank Marshall Davis used to shoot images of Barack Obama's mother and put them in men's magazines. All right. So Frank Marshall Davis used to shoot images of Barack Obama's mother and put them in men's magazines. Here's the evidence right here. All right. If I may, just Google this magazine right here. So Frank Marshall Davis, Barack Obama's mentor, used to shoot photographs of Barack Obama's mother for men's magazines. Now you might think, Howard Moore, that's slander, but now we're finna get into this aspect of the so-called Black Power movements, right? Black liberation theology movements, etc. So another individual responsible is a man named Harry Haywood, right? Harry Haywood. This is him with his wife, Gwendolyn, right? Now I told you that all of our so-called leaders have been in bed with the enemy. Well, this individual right here was literally in bed with the enemy. This is Harry Haywood and his wife Gwendolyn. Now, who is Harry Haywood? Who is Harry Haywood and why is he important? Well, he wrote a book. He wrote a book called Black Bolsheviks. If I may, check out the book, Black Bolshevik, an autobiography of Afro-American communists by Harry Haywood. All right. Now, Harry Haywood was the founder of the Maoist New Communist Movement. He has affiliations with the Students for a Democratic Society, the Progressive Labor Party, and the Black Panther Party. And that's going to tie us into what we're going to talk about with Angela Davis here a little bit later. Now, Harry Haywood was the founder of the Maoist New Communist Movement and had affiliations with the Students for Democratic Society. Now, the Students for a Democratic Society, they had a leader, an oppressor's daughter, so-called white lady. She was in charge of the SDS, and she's responsible for making LSD popular among so-called activists, so-called social activists. Now, we're talking about the 1960s, the 1970s. It was this oppressor's daughter, this so-called white woman, all right, who was the head of the Students for a Democratic Society. It's Bernadine Dohrn. You can look her up. Bernadine Dohrn is responsible for making LSD popular amongst all the social activists of the 60s and the 70s. And it all comes from this cat right here, Harry Haywood. All right. Now, we talked about Haywood was the founder that comes from the Chinese ruler Mao Zedong. Now, the problem with that is that Mao Zedong was a Jesuit, right? And you can look this up. Mao Zedong was a Jesuit that studied at the feet of this devil, right? This devil, Laszlo Ladany. If I may, Google Laszlo Ladany and his relationship with Mao Zedong. Now, this is also more, again, how we get this influence on our culture today. All right, like I said, all of our so-called leaders had been in bed with the enemy. All right. Harry Haywood, founder of the Maoist New Communist Movement, all comes from this devil right here. Again, all of our so-called leaders have been in bed with the enemy. All right, so here's another one. All right, African People's Socialist Party. This was started in Kentucky, and as you see, they're continuing these red, black, and green colors, right? These red, black, and green colors that supposedly come from Marcus Garvey's movement. Now, we just talked about Marcus Garvey. We talked about Marcus Garvey being good friends with two white supremacists, two eugenicists that were responsible for paper genocide of Native Indians. Now, these colors right here, this red, black, and green, what they don't tell you is that this green originally meant for Irish people. This green was originally for Irish people. So again, all of our so-called leaders have been in bed with the enemy. All right. So again, the African People's Socialist Party or Uhuru movement are pan-African movements that started in Africa, right? Now, this whole class has been on pan-Africanism, right? All of these so-called Black Power movements, all of these so-called Black liberation theology movements. All right, but let's talk about this word pan-African. And let's see if you still want to use this word pan-African after we're done with it. All right. So pan-African, this word pan comes from the Greek god Pan. Now, this Greek god was a alternative lifestyle person. All right. The god Pan, the Greek god Pan, is a god that has to do with homosexuality, right? And this is why you see LGBTQ pushed the way it is in the so-called black community. This is why you see so-called alternative lifestyle people in every black TV show you turn on, in every black movie you turn on. You see alternative lifestyle people being pushed in our communities, again, because the pan from Pan-African comes from this LGBTQ god Pan. Now, can you prove it? I can absolutely prove it. All right, let's go to etymology, right? Pan, the Greek god of shepherds and flocks, woods and fields, with the upper body of a man and horns and the lower part like a goat, 14th century. All right. His worship originated in Arcadia and gradually spread through Greece. Similarity to Pan, all, see Pan, we'll get back to it, led to his regard as the general personification of nature. He was fond of music and dancing with the forest nymphs. All right. And as you can see from the statue, Pan was fond of little boys also. Salakia. Now it said, see Pan. So we're going to see Pan. And we're going to show how the Greek god Pan is absolutely related to the prefix Pan. All right. Pan, word forming element meaning all, every, whole, all inclusive, from Greek pan. Commonly used as a prefix. All right, commonly used as a prefix. So Pan-American, Pan-German, Pan-African, here it is right here, Pan-European and Pan-Arabism. All right, so the prefix Pan in Pan-African absolutely comes from the Greek god Pan. And again, as we saw from the statue, that Greek god Pan was fond of little boys. Salakia. All right. So we have all of these influences of communism in all of these so-called black liberation movements. Salakia. So communism or communist thought comes from this devil right here. All right, this devil's name is Karl Marx, and the hand in the jacket means he's another Freemason. So you see the influence of Freemasonry and communism in all of our so-called black liberation movements. All right, you see communism and Freemasonry in all of our so-called black liberation movements. So let's get into Karl Marx a little bit. We've got some quotes from Karl Marx. All right. It says, when the U.S. annexed California after the Mexican-American War, Marx wrote, without violence, nothing is ever accomplished in history. It is a misfortune that magnificent California was seized from the lazy Mexican who did not know what to do with it. So we have Karl Marx right here making racist remarks about Hispanic people. All right. Frederick Engels added. Now here's another devil to look up. Frederick Engels. All right. In America, we have witnessed the conquest of Mexico and have rejoiced at it. It is to the interest of its own development that Mexico will be placed under the tutelage of the United States. Many of Karl Marx's racist ideas were reported in Karl Marx Racist, a book written by Nathaniel Weil, a former member of the U.S. Communist Party. Here's the quote right here. All right, so we have Karl Marx making racist comments toward our Hispanic brothers and sisters. Let's see what else he has to say. All right. Here's more from Karl Marx, 1877. Who was Karl Marx's 1887? Paul Lafargue, who was Karl Marx's son-in-law, was a candidate for the council seat in a Paris district that contained a zoo. Engels claimed that Paul had 1/8 or 1/12 nigger blood. In an April 1887 letter to Paul's wife, Engels wrote that being in his quality as a nigger, a degree nearer to the rest of the animal kingdom than the rest of us, he is undoubtedly the most appropriate representative of that district. So we have racist comments made from Karl Marx toward blacks and Hispanics. And we've got the sources right here. So again, we see the influence of communism, right? We see the influence of Freemasonry, which is another racist organization. And we see the origin of the word pan and pan-African being LGBTQ. So how can you have any kind of self-respect and call yourself a pan anything, right? How can you have any kind of self-respect and call yourself a pan anything? Or how can you be a part of anything that promotes Freemasonry and communism, like all of our so-called liberation organizations do? And speaking of liberation theology, this is Reverend James Cone. Now, again, it's going back to Reverend or ministers, just like we talked about Richard Allen and Absalom Jones back at the beginning. Now, he's the founder of the concept of Black liberation theology. All right. Now, this is an article on liberation theology. And it says, this article aims to explore the common grounds and the differences between Marxism and liberation theology. Again, it's going back to Karl Marx, right? The Freemason, the founder of communist thought. And we just read that he made racist remarks towards blacks and Hispanics. All right. It says both focus on hope as a convergence for profound dialogue. On the one hand, both in Marxism and liberation theology, hope is firstly an orientation for a better quality of life within one's lifetime than in the afterlife, which is beyond the reaches of humankind. So again, it talks about the influences of Marxism or communism on so-called liberation theology. All right. The rest of the article, although the actualization of hope is not yet witnessed as a fact, but is still an as if ideal, the belief both in Marxism and liberation theology is persistent in the realization of hope through human action. So again, we're talking about the influence. We're talking about the influence of white Freemasonry, white communism, white back to Africa movements, right? And white Greek LGBTQ influence in all of our so-called Black Power movements, so-called Black liberation movements, etc. All right. Now, Angela Davis. All right. I've been talking about Angela Davis for about 2 weeks now. All right. Angela Davis. All right. So, Angela Davis is related to William Brewster on her father's side. All right. William Brewster was a pilgrim that came here on the Mayflower in 1620 and is the 10th great grandfather of Angela Davis on her father's side. Now, in the ISUPK, we teach that you are the seed of your father. You are who your father is. So this is Angela Davis's 10th great grandfather on her father's side, which makes Angela Davis a Edomite, which makes Angela Davis a so-called oppressor. It's no wonder that Angela Davis was pushing communist rhetoric, and why communist rhetoric was all through the so-called Black Panther Party. All right. It says Davis became nationally known in 1970 when guns she owned were used in the holdup of a Martin County courtroom in California, which left 4 dead, including a judge. After the FBI issued a warrant for her arrest, she went on the run and became listed as one of the department's 10 most wanted. After her eventual arrest, she spent 16 months in jail before being found not guilty. Davis was born in Birmingham, Alabama in 1944 during the era of segregation and violent racial division in the South. While studying in West Germany in her youth, she was drawn to far-left politics and upon returning to the U.S. became involved with the Black Panthers and the Communist Party of the United States. She appeared shocked during a TV interview that aired this week in which Finding Your Roots host Henry Louis Gates Jr. told her of her ancestry. All right, it says the Mayflower was the English boat that brought white English families known as Pilgrims to the American continent to permanently establish the New England colony in 1620. You are descended from the 101 people who sailed on the Mayflower, reiterated Gates, who was the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard. The 1-hour show in which public figures learned about the ancestry outlined how William Brewster, who traveled aboard the boat with his wife, Mary Wentworth Brewster, was Angela Davis's 10th great grandfather. All right, so here's the evidence that Angela Davis, no wonder Angela Davis was so influenced by so-called white communist propaganda, is because Angela Davis is descended from a so-called white man, a so-called the biblical Edomites on her father's side. All right. So Angela Davis, not only is she an Edomite, she is also a member of the LGBTQ. All right, it says from 1980 to 1983, Davis was married to Hilton Braithwaite. In 1997, she came out as lesbian in an interview with Out magazine. By 2020, Davis was living openly with her partner, the academic Gina Dent, a fellow humanities scholar and intersectional feminist researcher at Santa Cruz. Angela Davis is LGBT. All right, so no wonder she pushes communist rhetoric. It's no wonder she's a member of the LGBT community, because as I've been showing this entire class, all of our so-called leaders have been in bed with the enemy. All right. All of our beliefs, all of our communist socialist beliefs, all of our Freemasonic beliefs, all of our back to Africa beliefs, all of our pan-African beliefs all come from our oppressor, all come from so-called white people. All right, so before we end this, we talked about who we're not. All right, we're not Pan-Africans, we're not communists, we're not Freemasons, right? We're not LGBT people, regardless of what what this society tries to push on us. Let's get into who Blacks and Hispanics really are briefly before we end the class. All right. So the first thing we'll read is from Babylon of Timbuktu by Rudolph Windsor. And we're going to go to page 84. Babylon of Timbuktu, Rudolph Windsor. All right, it says in the year 65 BC, the Roman armies under General Pompey captured Jerusalem. In 70 AD, General Vespasian and his son Titus put an end to the Jewish state with great slaughter. During the period of the military governors of Palestine, many outrages and atrocities were committed against the residue of the people. During the period from Pompey to Julius, it has been estimated that over 1 million Jews fled into Africa, fleeing from Roman persecution and slavery. The slave markets were full of Black Jewish slaves. Again, this is page 84. Babylon of Timbuktu says the slave markets were full of Black Jewish slaves. All right, so that's Rudolph Windsor, Babylon of Timbuktu. All right. The next book, if I may, to check out is a history of the American Indians. Right, history of the American Indians, particularly the nations adjoining the Mississippi, East and West Florida, Georgia, South and North Carolina, and Virginia. All right. And according to this book, all right, it says, let us now return to the copper color American Hebrews. So according to this book, History of the American Indians, right, it says the copper colored people, right, the copper color American Hebrews. It's talking about the indigenous people of the Americas being Israelites. All right, then the last book, here's the source. All right, Christopher Columbus and the Participation of the Jews in the Spanish and Portuguese Discoveries. It was written in 1894. All right, this is page 90. It says, under the ban of expulsion, persecuted and homeless from taking part in the voyage, among the explorer's companions whose names have come down to us, there were several men of Jewish stock. For example, Luis de Torres, a Jew who had occupied the position under the governor of Murcia, who was baptized shortly before Columbus sailed. As he understood Hebrew, Chaldee, and some Arabic, Columbus employed him as an interpreter. All right, so according to these last three books, Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Indians are the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, we're not members of the LGBT community. We're not Pan-African. We're not part of this back to Africa garbage. We're not We're not communists and we're not Freemasons. Again, all of these influences in our community have been given to us by our enemy. So with that, shalom. Yahweh Ba'Hashem, Yahweh Shabbarakatham, Yahweh Shamar Alatham Ba'Hashem, Slakia. Yahweh Shamar Alatham Ba'Hashem, Yahweh Shah. With that, class dismissed.
Black, Hispanic, and Native Indians. The Lord's 50. Fourth annual Passover is going down again this year. Sundown, April 1st at 500 South. Salisbury Street in Raleigh, North Carolina. At the Downtown Conventional Center. It's got enough room.